Have you ever questioned why India, once known as the Golden Bird, fell into the depths of poverty during the British rule? This intriguing question takes us on a journey back in time, to a period when India was a beacon of wealth, prosperity, and abundance, long before the advent of the British Empire. India, often referred to as Sone ki Chidiya or the Golden Bird, was a land rich in resources. It was renowned across the globe for its wealth and prosperity. The country was a treasure trove of precious metals, gems, and spices, making it a prime target for foreign invaders. But it wasn't just material wealth that made India affluent. The nation had a thriving economy with a robust agricultural sector, flourishing trade, and a well-established system of indigenous industries. However, this prosperous landscape began to change with the arrival of the British East India Company in the early 17th century. The British, initially attracted by the lucrative spice trade, soon realized the potential wealth that could be extracted from this abundant land. As their control extended, the British began to exploit India's resources to fuel their own industrial revolution back home. The once flourishing economy of India started to dwindle. The shift was gradual but destructive. The British systematically dismantled India's indigenous industries, imposed heavy taxes, and forced farmers to grow cash crops instead of food, leading to widespread famine and poverty. The Golden Bird was losing its sheen, and poverty started to grip the nation. So, why did India, a country known for its wealth and prosperity, fall into the depths of poverty under British rule? The answer lies in the systematic exploitation and resource drain that occurred during this period. In the following scenes, we delve deeper into how the British rule led to the rise of poverty in India. The journey is long and the story complex, but understanding this history is crucial to comprehending the present. So, let's delve deeper, scene by scene, into the story of India's transformation from the Golden Bird to a nation grappling with poverty. The British set foot in India around the 1600s, marking the beginning of a drastic transformation. The British East India Company, initially a commercial enterprise, arrived on Indian shores with the primary intention of trading. India at the time was a prosperous nation, rich in resources and a hub for global trade. But as the British began to establish their presence, the dynamics started to shift. They began as traders, bartering goods and commodities. But over time their ambitions grew. The British East India Company, under the guise of trade, started to gain political control. The Mughals, who were in power during the time, were gradually weakened, and the British began their transition from merchants to rulers. This shift wasn't just about a change in governance. It marked the beginning of exploitation on a massive scale. The British, having realized the abundant resources that India had to offer, began to drain them away for their own benefit. India, once a prosperous nation, became the victim of systematic resource extraction. The wealth that was once used to build magnificent palaces to foster arts and literature was now being siphoned off to another land. The British imposed heavy taxes on the Indian populace, further adding to their woes. They monopolized industries, controlled trade, and used India's resources to fuel their industrial revolution back home. The British didn't just take over the governance of India. They took over its economy, its resources, and its wealth. This wasn't just colonization. It was economic exploitation on an unimaginable scale. The prosperity that once defined India was gradually replaced with hardship and poverty. And so India, once the Golden Bird, was stripped of its feathers, its wealth, its prosperity. The British East India Company had started as traders, but they had become rulers, exploiting a prosperous nation for their own gains. By the mid-1800s, the British had a firm grip over India, and the seeds of poverty were sown. With the British in control, India's wealth began to dwindle, paving the way for widespread poverty. As we delve deeper into the impact of the British rule, we find that it wasn't just about political dominance. It was a calculated economic exploitation that led to a significant drain of India's resources. The British systematically extracted wealth from India, using it to fuel their own industrial revolution and economic growth. But how did this happen? Well, they did it through a process known as drain of wealth. India's resources, both natural and human, were exploited to the fullest. Precious raw materials were extracted and shipped off to Britain, leaving little for India's own use. This was coupled with heavy taxation, which further impoverished the Indian populace. Now, let's turn our attention to India's industries. During the British rule, India's thriving textile, shipbuilding, and steel industries, among others, were systematically suppressed. The British imposed heavy tariffs on Indian goods, making them uncompetitive in their own markets. At the same time, goods from Britain were imported into India tax-free, flooding the markets with cheap British goods. This had a cascade effect. Indian industries couldn't compete, leading to factory shutdowns and widespread unemployment. The once thriving industrial cities turned into ghost towns, with poverty, hunger, and despair taking hold of the populace. But it wasn't just the industries that suffered. Agriculture, the backbone of India's economy, was also severely impacted. The British introduced new land revenue systems that were heavily skewed in their favor, pushing the farmers into a cycle of debt and poverty. The fertile lands of India were used to grow cash crops for export, instead of food crops to feed the local population, leading to famines and widespread starvation. So, you see, the British didn't just rule India, they drained it. They squeezed out its wealth, suppressed its industries, exploited its people, and left behind a legacy of poverty and despair. As a result, India, once a prosperous nation, was transformed into a land of poverty and despair. The British left India in 1947, but the scars of their rule were deeply etched in the country's socio-economic fabric. As the British sailed away, leaving behind the land they had governed for nearly 2 centuries, India was left grappling with the aftermath of the colonial rule that had drained its wealth and resources, leaving the nation on the brink of widespread poverty. The British had systematically dismantled India's traditional economic system, replacing it with a colonial one that primarily served their interests. As a result, the Indian economy, once a global powerhouse, was reduced to a mere supplier of raw materials to Britain's booming industrial sector. India's agriculture, which was the backbone of its economy, was also severely affected. The British introduced new land revenue systems which led to the impoverishment of farmers and created a deep divide between the rural and urban sectors. The education system too was not spared. English was imposed as the medium of instruction, creating a wide gap between the English-educated elite and the rest of the population. This led to a social divide that further perpetuated the cycle of poverty. Even after gaining independence, India struggled to recover from the economic and social disruptions caused by British rule. The country had to rebuild its economy from scratch, a task that was further complicated by the partition-induced refugee crisis and the ensuing communal violence. The long-term impacts of British rule are still evident in India's struggle against poverty. Despite significant strides in economic growth and development, India continues to grapple with issues such as income inequality, illiteracy, and lack of access to basic amenities, much of which can be traced back to the systemic issues introduced during the colonial era. In conclusion, while the British may have physically left India over 70 years ago, the effects of their rule continue to reverberate through the country's socio-economic fabric. The British may have left, but the legacy of their rule continues to impact India's struggle against poverty. So, what have we learned about the rise of poverty in India under British rule? In our journey through this historical period, we've unraveled the intricate tapestry of events that led to the surge of poverty in India during British colonial rule. We began by questioning India's poverty, delving into the economic conditions preceding the advent of British rule and their subsequent transformation. The advent of British rule marked a turning point for India. The country, once known for its thriving economy, experienced a dramatic shift. The British introduced policies that served their interests, creating a system that drained resources from India. This economic drain was the beginning of a long, arduous era of poverty and hardship for the Indian people. We saw the rise of poverty under British rule, a phase characterized by high taxes, land alienation, and the collapse of local industries. The British, driven by their need for raw materials and markets, exploited India's resources, leading to the gradual impoverishment of its people. The economic policies they instituted were not designed to foster growth or prosperity, but rather to feed the British Empire's insatiable appetite for wealth. In the aftermath of British rule, India was left grappling with the enormous task of rebuilding its economy and society. The long-term impacts of this colonial rule were far-reaching, and they continue to influence India's economic landscape even today. To this day, India battles with issues rooted in its colonial past, such as economic inequality and social disparity. However, it's important to remember that India's story does not end with its struggle. The country has shown remarkable resilience, rising from the ashes of its colonial past to become one of the world's fastest-growing economies. In conclusion, the story of India's poverty under British rule is a complex and multifaceted one. It's a testament to the country's resilience and an important chapter in its journey towards progress. It's a story that reminds us of the indomitable spirit of a nation that, despite the odds, continues to strive for a brighter future. The story of India's poverty under British rule is a testament to the country's resilience and an important chapter in its journey towards progress.